Okay, we're going to pick up where we left off from our last video section, which is a little bit long. They want to go too long. I wanted to keep it under 50 minutes, and it was about 18 minutes. So I stopped it short of finishing section 2b of chapter 8 on the axial and appendicular skeleton. So we're talking about the clinical view here of the cleft lip, of a cleft lip and a cleft palate. Now a cleft lip, and differentiating it from that and a cleft palate. Cleft lip is an incomplete fusion of the upper jaw in the components of an embryo. There's like a split upper lip extending from the mouth to the side of one nostril. And it has a multifactorial etiology, whereas a cleft palate is a congenital fissure in the palate midline. Left and right maxillary and the palatine bones or palatine bones are incompletely fused. This person may have trouble swallowing. Food traveling from the oral to nasal cavity can be happening, multifactorial etiology again, and sometimes occurs with a cleft lip. So it could combine with a cleft lip or it could be entirely separate. For the internal view of the cranial base, just finishing the last little bit here talking about the cranial base, the cranial fossa, or fossae, I should say. There are three curved depressions on the cranial cavity floor, and they house the lobes of the brain, the anterior, middle, and the posterior cranial fossae, or fossae. So here we have the frontal lobe of the cerebrum up here, the temporal lobe of the cerebrum, and the cerebellum, the inferior portion of the brain there, so to speak. And then we have the posterior cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and we have the anterior cranial fossa, the lateral view here. And then from the superior view, the anterior cranial fossa, and then we have the middle cranial fossa, and the posterior cranial fossa. And also within that, we have the lesser wing of the sphenoid, the sella turcica, the petrous part of the temporal bone, jugular foramen, and the foramen magnum. So for that section, you should know then what bones may be prominently seen in an anterior view of the skull. You can bet in class we'll be quizzed on that, both in terms of multiple choice or matching on the exam, or given a bunch of bone names and then seeing open spaces. You should know them well enough to know which one's which. Whereas in your lab, once again, you'll have to know it by heart in many cases, and you should know what those are. Based on the study guides. What bones form the middle cranial fossa and which part of the brain resides in this fossa also. Sutures. Sutures are immovable joints, and they form the boundaries between the cranial bones. A coronal suture is specifically extending laterally across the superior surface of the skull, and there's an articulation between the anterior and the frontal and the posterior parietal bones. The lambdoid suture extends across the posterior skull surface, and there's an articulation between the parietal bones and the occipital bone there. That is the lambdoid suture, and it's named for resembling the Greek letter lambda. The sagittal suture extends through the coronal and the lambdoid sutures. It's an articulation between the right and the left parietal bones. The squamous suture is an articulation between the temporal bone and the parietal bone on each side of the skull. Sutural bones, or the Wormian bones, represent independent bone ossification centers, and they're the most common and numerous in the lambdoid suture. Craniosynostosis is a premature fusion of one or more cranial sutures. Clinical view here, I should make note of that these are clinical situations or challenges for some individuals. In this craniosynostosis, there's a premature fusion of one or more cranial sutures. If it's not surgically treated, this individual grows up with an unusual cranial-facial shape. The shape varies according to which suture is closed prematurely. And plagiocephaly or plagiocephaly is an asymmetric head shape. It's caused by unilateral craniosynostosis or normal deformational factors. So you should know after this section then what bones articulate at the lambdoid suture and when does the suture typically fuse. Orbital complex. The orbits enclose and protect the eyes and the eye muscles, and they consist of multiple bones that form each orbit. Let's get a closer look. So the roof of the here's the orbit here. The roof of the orbit. We have the lesser wing of the sphenoid bone and the orbital part of the frontal bone. This all being the frontal bone here, right? And the sphenoid is here, back all in here. And the zygomatic process of the frontal bone, whereas this is a zygomatic bone, the green one looking here. The greater wing of the sphenoid bone here, the orbital surface of that zygomatic bone, and of course this is just pointing to the zygomatic bone as a whole. The inferior orbital fissure here, the superior orbital fissure here. And then as far as the medial wall of that orbit goes, we have the frontal process of the maxilla, it's the maxillary bone here, and the lacrimal bone. And we have the orbital plate of that ethmoid bone down in, right in here. And the floor of the orbit is the orbital process of the palatine bone, that little guy right there, orbital surface of the maxilla, and we already mentioned the zygomatic bone. Now for the paranasal sinuses, the nasal complex encloses the nasal cavity and the paranasal sinuses, includes the bone and the cartilage. The paranasal sinuses are air-filled chambers that open into the nasal cavity, and the mucous membrane humidifies and warms the inhaled air. It causes the skull bones to be lighter, and it provides resonance to your voice. And the ethmoidal, the frontal, and the maxillary, and the sphenoidal sinuses are part of the paranasal sinuses. So with that nasal complex, we have here this whole nasal complex here, the frontal bone, and the crista galli of the ethmoid bone, cribriform plate of the ethmoid bone, the sella turcica, sphenoidal sinus, perpendicular plate of the palatine bone, the sphenoid bone, horizontal plate of the palatine bone. So we have frontal sinus nasal bone being here, the superior nasal concha is here, the middle nasal concha is here, lacrimal bone, the inferior nasal concha, and the maxilla, and again the palatine process of the maxilla now here. And looking basically at a cadaver now, the ethmoidal sinus here, right orbit, brain, right, cerebrum up here, and then the frontal sinus here, superior nasal concha right there, the middle nasal concha here, and then the maxillary sinus and the inferior nasal concha. That being a coronal cut, of course. Oops. Then looking here, we have the frontal sinus for the anterior view here for the sinuses, and the ethmoidal sinuses here, and the maxillary sinus here for the anterior view, and the lateral sella turcica, frontal sinus, ethmoidal sinuses, sphenoidal sinus, and the maxillary sinus. So you should now then know what bones form the floor of the orbit, and which four bones are the paranasal sinuses located. In section 8.3, you should now be able to locate and identify the auditory ossicles and describe the structure and function of the hyoid bone. The auditory ossicles, as far as bones that are associated with the skull, are three tiny ear bones. They're housed in the petrous part of each temporal bone, and the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. The hyoid bone is slender or curved bone. It's inferior to the skull between the mandible and the larynx. It does not articulate with any other bone. It has a medial body and two horn-like processes that are greater and lesser cornua. They are the attachment sites for the tongue and the larynx muscles and ligaments. So here we have our hyoid bone here. Now that hyoid, that greater cornu, be the up here, right? The lesser cornu, and a little guy right in here on each side. And of course the body of that hyoid bone, lateral and anterior view. And of course you'll need to know how to identify it properly from each direction. So you then should now know what are the names of auditory ossicles and in what specific bone are they found. Our final section for this video, for the sex and age determination from analysis of the skull, you should be able to identify the similarities and differences between the male and the female skulls. You should be able to compare the structure of the fetal, the child, and the adult skulls, and list the fontanelles and the ages at which they close. So talking about differences in the female and the male skulls, it's an example of sexual dimorphism. The female features are more delicate and small, typically referred to as female, whereas male features are what's thought to be more male features, tend to be larger and bulkier. Obviously, a male can have more female-type features, and a female can have more male-like features. If there's more generalizations, but mostly true. Features do vary among populations. It's difficult to determine sex of an infant and juvenile remains, based on there's so many variants within those age ranges. In some cases, appear female-like until after puberty. A lot of bones can make you not really be sure if you're looking at certain parts of the body, in this case the skull, is this a male or a female? Shape and structure is different in infants and adults. The cranial sutures are almost fully developed by age 5. Young child's cranium is relatively large compared to the body. So obviously you can find the whole body. It's going to make it a whole lot easier versus just the skull. The infant's cranial bones are not large enough to surround the brain completely. Okay? Fontanelles are cranial bones that are interconnected by dense, regular connective tissue. They're the soft spots on a baby's head, those fontanelles. They enable some flexion body plates during birth, and then they ease the baby's passage through the birth canal. It has to be able to malform to some extent to be able to get through the birth canal. And oftentimes the idea of a baby having a perfect shaped head after birth is not the case. My first child didn't have much of a deformed skull, so to speak. Deformed is the wrong choice of words, but not being what you typically think of as a natural skull for an infant. Because if you see them right at birth, there may be some changes there. They had to get through the birth canal. There's a small mastoid and sphenoidal fontanelles. The posterior fontanelle closes around 9 months, and the anterior fontanelle closes around 15 months. Here's the fetal skull. That's too big. Let's keep it how it was. The anterior fontanelle here, the parietal bone, posterior fontanelle, occipital bone, the mastoid fontanelle, temporal bone, the sphenoidal fontanelle, and the sphenoid bone. Here's the mandible, of course, and frontal bone for the post-superior view here, and the anterior fontanelle, parietal bone, and the posterior fontanelle, just between the fontanelle, between the occipital bone and the parietal bone. So you should then know what are some features that differ between female and male skulls, and what are the two largest fontanelles, and when do they disappear. And that's section 8.4. We'll come back for section 8.5 and bones of the vertebral column next.